Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 109. Today's guest is Sarah Gailey. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Today I am pleased to welcome back writer Sarah Gailey. Hugo Award winner and best-selling author Sarah Gailey is an internationally published writer of fiction and nonfiction. Their nonfiction has been published by Mashable and the Boston Globe, and they won a Hugo Award for Best Fan Writer. Their most recent fiction credits include Vice and The Atlantic. Their debut novella, River of Teeth, was a 2018 Hugo and Nebula Award finalist. Their best-selling adult novel debut, Magic for Liars, was published in 2019. Their latest novella, Upright Women Wanted, was published in February 2020. Their young adult novel debut, When We Were Magic, came out in March 2020. You can find links to their work at sarahgailey.com. Find them on social media at GaileyFrey. Sarah first came on the show back in 2017 when we talked about their recently published debut novella, River of Teeth. That happened to be one of my favorite conversations I've had for the show, and if you want more after listening to today's show, I do recommend going back and checking that one out. It's episode 52. Today we're talking about their latest book, their debut YA fantasy novel, When We Were Magic. The story centers on a close-knit group of high school girls who, in addition to being tight friends, all have magical powers. It begins with a magical accident that kills a boy, and the friends come together to try to make things right. Now, there's a lot in this book that I loved in terms of representation, in terms of how it plays against certain genre tropes. But I think what I loved most, and you'll hear us talk about this in our conversation, is how the book portrays the friendship between these characters. It's uplifting and heartwarming without ever being saccharine. It just made me happy, you know? So I do recommend picking up a copy for yourself, and there's a link in the show notes where you can do that. I've also put links to Sarah's other recent books, Magic for Liars and Upright Women Wanted, both of which I also loved. And there's also a link to Sarah's Substack newsletter, which is called Here's the Thing. A subscription to the newsletter is just $5 per month, and it's well worth it. I've been a subscriber for years now, since back when the newsletter was on a whole different platform, and I just adore it. Sarah sends out pieces of short fiction, personal essays, occasionally poetry. Lately, they've been doing a regular feature where people send in the contents of their cabinets, and Sarah will come up with a recipe they can use. It's all fantastic, and you can find that at sarahgailey.substack.com. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Sarah Gailey. Since the last time we talked, that was in July of 2017, and we were talking...
Oh, so 150 years ago.
Yeah, it was quite a, it feels even longer ago than it usually would, I think. But at that point, you had just... we were talking in advance of the release of Taste of Marrow. And so at that point, you had two novellas and a novelette just recently published. In the interim, and actually I was looking at the pub dates, it's only been in the past 9 months. You've published 3 books in the last 9 months. So
Please excuse my slightly unhinged laughter. But it's just, every time I think about that, I feel like a few of my brain cells die.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my question. Is like, how does it feel to publish 3 books in the span of 9 months? That seems like a lot.
I've aged pretty rapidly in the last year, especially in the last few months. You know, right now we're recording this toward the end of April, and 2 months ago I was in the middle of this 30-day period during which I was releasing 2 books and also coordinating, decorating, and officiating a wedding, which involved a road trip between Los Angeles and Portland and back. It was completely bonkers. And, you know, I was fortunate enough to get my books out the door before the pandemic really hit the West Coast of the US in a way that we were recognizing and responding to. So I basically went from book launch madness for like 11 months, because there's a lead up to book launch. And when Magic for Liars came out, I spent the month before it came out doing a lot of heavy promotion work, just trying to be like, hey, I have a book, please buy it. through those 9 months, I wrote part of a book during those 9 months too, and then, did promotion and release for 2 more books, and also planned and then pulled off this amazing wedding. And then came home from the launch event for my most recent book that came out when we were Magic, and didn't go out of the apartment again. Because it was like, we debated whether to have that event, because we were like, oh, it seems like people are getting sick. Like, is this going to be a risk? And we were like, let's go ahead and do it. And we did that. And then it was like the vault slammed shut on me after that. And then, of course, I spent the next week after that just getting my home into a place where we could be essentially in a siege state, trying not to leave, trying not to let anybody else in for as long as possible. And it's just been that ever since. So I'm completely unhinged. I'm very disoriented, and it's this weird thing where all of us are discovering that being quarantined and socially distanced doesn't actually equal rest. Yeah. So I am fully burned out and exhausted. I'm a husk of a person, but I'm very happy to be this kind of a husk.
Well, let me just say, I really enjoyed all 3 of these books quite a bit. I thought maybe, since it's the most recent and certainly the freshest in my mind, maybe we would mainly talk about When We Were Magic, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So yeah, I really enjoyed this book quite a bit. And one of the things I was thinking about is this: When We Were Magic is your first YA novel. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because this is your fifth book overall, but your first YA. And I want to kind of to talk a little bit about what, whether that felt different to you writing YA, whether what kind of considerations might have been different in the writing with that.
I mean, it was completely different. I was really intimidated to try and write young adult. When I look at the field of young adult literature right now, it's incredible. I think it's one of the genres of literature where people are taking some of the biggest risks right now, and being very experimental. And, the writers in YA right now are just brilliant. And teens are difficult demographic to write for, in my opinion, because they're so smart and sharp, and the things that they think about, while some things stay the same, no matter what generation you're in, other things change all the time. Even just the language that teenagers use to talk to each other changes all the time. And it's so easy to write something that is out of touch or condescending or corny, just because I, as a now 30-year-old adult, don't know what's actually happening in the life of a 15-year-old. I was very nervous to try and get into that world. But my agent very intelligently pushed my buttons and said, you don't have to write YA if you feel like you don't have anything to say to teenagers today. And I was like, oh, well, shit, great. Okay, I guess I have to. And, the way that my agent advised me to approach it was to think about that question. What's the thing that you would want to say to a teenager today? And I was like, I don't know. I'm very intimidated by the teenagers of today. I would probably say to them, please carry on. You're doing great. And my agent was like, all right, well, think about it this way. What do you wish someone had said to you when you were a teenager?
Yeah. So one of the things that I noticed a lot about this book is, to me, it felt different from a lot of the other YA that I've read. And in ways that felt really, I can't think of a better word than lovely or wonderful, because one of the things that I've noticed often drives different YA stories that I've read has to do with this sort of antagonism between the narrator and either their parental figures or teacher figures or their social group. Mm-hmm. And this book really didn't do that. The main character, Alexis, her dads are so normal and functional and understanding. And her social group, this group of 6 girls that she's a part of that are, the main sort of focus of the story, they really never fail to have each other's backs. And it seemed like such a departure from other YA that I've read. And I have to assume that must have been intentional and on your mind when you were writing it. But can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That was part of the mission of this book for me. Part of the drive was to normalize conflict and struggle and anxiety by putting it in the context of, how life actually goes, how life actually works. When I think about my own teenage years, the things that jump out at me are those conflicts and those moments of strife and tension, right? Those are the things a lot of us remember. They shape us as people. And so we remember our teenage years as being kind of a tornado of conflict and fear and rejection and pain and heartache. But if you hang out with and talk to and observe teenagers today, they have all those things going on, but they also have so much joy and tenderness. They care for each other really well. They love each other as best they know how. Even when they're screwing up, even when they're communicating poorly, they really care about each other. And when I started thinking about that, I started remembering all the things from my teenage years where, my friends and I would sit during the lunch hour and sit outside in the sun and lay our heads in each other's laps just to enjoy human connection in between classes. The way that we would share food with each other completely freely without really thinking about, well, shit, I don't have any more lunch money for the week, but you didn't have lunch today, so I'm going to give you some of mine. The way that we would mend each other's clothes, we try to take care of each other. Humans are innately social creatures, by which I don't mean we're extroverts, but I mean we have this drive to care for each other as best we can. We're seeing so much of that right now. And teens are no exception to that. I wanted to write a book that was about that tenderness and care that people have for each other, even when they're anxious and angry and fighting and feeling left out and, trying to hide a body. That was really important to me with this book. Also, I wanted to write a book that had a lot of respect for teenagers. I feel like a lot of YA does show respect for teenagers, and that's the YA that I like. And there's also YA out there that treats teenagers as if they're fickle and stupid and immature and, as if they're not trying their best, as if they're just being bad to be bad. And I find that really frustrating. I found it frustrating when I was a teenager reading it, because when I was 17, I was making lots of foolish decisions, but they were the best decisions I knew how to make. So what I wanted to do with this book was write a story where the teenagers being represented are always doing the best they can with the tools and information that they have. The way that life works is that teenagers usually, almost always, have limited experience, limited information, and limited tools and limited agency available to them. But with those limited things, they still are always doing the best that they can, and they do a pretty damn good job most of the time. I think about how so many of us are cooking experimentally because we're like, I don't want to go to the store, but the only thing that's in my pantry is this bag of beans that I've never seen before and a thing of ketchup. And what am I going to do with this? And then we make a great meal out of it. And I feel like that's how teenagers live their lives every day. They're like, okay, I'm not allowed to vote. I can't have a job because my parents won't let me. I am running on very little sleep. No one will tell me the truth about a lot of stuff in the world. And the people who have prepared me to try and interact with human beings are bringing all of their own trauma and brokenness to the lessons they teach me and passing it on to me. But I have to try and get to prom. How am I going to do it? And they do it. They're innovative, they're creative, they're dynamic, and above all, so many of them are just good people who are trying so hard every single day. I wanted this book to give them as much credit as I try to give them.
Yeah. This is one of those things that does seem to be sort of eternal, is the way that older people so often do want to talk down to teenagers. And yet it's not as though, like you were saying, when you were 17, you made foolish decisions, even though they were the best ones you could. Certainly that was true of me at 17. It's also true of me at 40. So, and having, I mean, that seems to me like one of the things that as an artist, if we're trying to talk to people across this age gap, that I always hesitate to say that with age comes any kind of wisdom. I do think that, there is something to be said about having a little more experience in the world, but it's not as though it really does make you any wiser. It just sort of, maybe you get a few more tools if you're lucky. But, or if you happen to have a good therapist or something,
I think so much of it really is experience. So I think you're right. I think so much of it is about experience and, again, agency. Like, I can make better decisions now because I can make my own decisions. But when you're a teenager, a lot of your life is governed by other people who don't necessarily have access to your interiority, who don't necessarily have the ability to prioritize your needs fully, who are being controlled by other people who don't think about your needs at all. I think that part of why we have this impulse to condescend to teenagers is because I think that we culturally feel a fear of the way that teenagers are so resourceful. If we gave them access to all the agency and experience that you and I have, would they make better decisions than we do? Would we lose our excuse of, age and immaturity? I think that we really culturally have a fear of the answer to that question sometimes.
Yeah, it reminds me of this thing I remember hearing. I don't remember where. This was probably like in my college psych class or something, but talking about how the difference in the way that older people and younger people learn and have intelligence, that they use this phrase that I think that like young people have what they called elastic intelligence and older people have crystallized intelligence, where it's like when you're young, you're still like learning and figuring things out. And so you don't have necessarily a deep wealth of experience to draw on, but you're more able to figure things out newly, where when you're older, it's harder to learn new things once you get to a certain age, but that you have a lot more experience that you can draw and kind of make up for that. I thought that was really interesting. It kind of seems, I don't know, maybe at least tangentially related to what you're talking about. Maybe.
Yeah, that is such a cool concept. And I mean, what a great way of putting that, right? That like, I fear and am envious of that elasticity, that ability to learn new things. And also, I think sometimes it frustrates adults who aren't in that place anymore, who have that crystallized intelligence, who are going like, why are you letting your friends tell you things that I think are wrong? And you're listening to them instead of listening to me? Why are you so flexible? And so it's hard to influence you and have that influence stick. That's really fascinating.
Yeah. Bringing that up, the relationship that Alexis has with her fathers in this book is interesting because like you do see a little bit of that, like we understand things differently from the way that you understand them. At the same time, they're not condescending to her when they're in not necessarily sort of conflict or tension with each other. I mean, I guess I'm not a teenager anymore, so I don't know how an adolescent person would view these interactions. But to me, I really felt like I could see validity on both sides of those interactions, where like they're sort of in conflict, but nobody's actually wrong. I thought that was a really interesting way of presenting it. And I guess I do wonder, I mean, I'm sure that, like you were saying, teenagers are smart. They can figure these things out too. I thought that was a really interesting, the dynamic between Alexis and her dad's is, I don't know, it just felt so wholesome.
It was so wild to write. I remember contacting a friend of mine who also writes young adult fiction and being like, okay, you wrote a book where there's a really good parent-child teen relationship. How do you do it? Like, how did you come up with this? This was really a case where this will come as no surprise to anyone who knows anything about me. I think representation is so important in literature, and especially in young adult literature, because teens are learning what the world looks like and how the world sees them. And what they see on the page in terms of representation of, say, their race or their sexuality or their gender or what have you is formative. It's a formative time to be taking in literature and media. I also wanted this book to include some representation of relationships. So often, I think, when I was a teenager and even as an adult, we get embroiled in narratives that we're familiar with. So, the narrative is, my partner cheated on me. I have to get really upset and kick them out, and it's all over. instead of my partner cheated on me, maybe there's a way for us to find what's wrong and broken in our relationship and fix it. Or the narrative of like, someone bumped into my car with their car, so I have to hop out of my car and hop up and down and yell at them instead of going, oh, who gives a shit? One of the narratives that I see really prevalent in young adult literature, which I don't think is a bad thing, that it's really prevalent, but is the absent or bad parent. The parents just don't understand thing, which, by the way, wild to go back and listen to that Will Smith song, which includes him trying to have sex with a 12-year-old.
Wow, I do not remember that. It's probably been 25 years since I've heard that song.
There's this whole section of the song where he takes his parents' car for a joyride, and he picks up this hot girl on the street, and he takes her to McDonald's, and she puts her hand on his thigh, and he's like getting a boner about it, and then he gets pulled over, and the cops are like, "This is a 12-year-old runaway, Will Smith. What are you doing with her? Transporting her across state lines? Is that what's happening?" Anyway, completely wild, completely bananas. So, going back to the point, we see this narrative all the time, like parents just don't understand, and again, that's what a lot of us remember from our teen years, is fighting with our parents, which is, the first few times in your life that maybe has happened when you're a teenager, when you're having fights where you really think that your parents are wrong and they don't get it, and they're not listening to you, as opposed to just being like, oof, I'm in trouble. That's what a lot of us hang on to. But there are relationships that are possible between kids and parents where the parents listen, do their best, are transparent with their feelings, model emotionally healthy conflict. And I wanted to put that on the page, not only to say, hey, you can have this with your parents, maybe if they're the kind of parents you can have this with, but also to say, hey, this kind of relationship is possible. The kind of relationship where your parents yell at you all the time and don't listen to you and don't pay attention to your needs isn't necessarily how it has to be, isn't necessarily normal. There's other ways that relationships can be. Because I think the first time you see that the relationship you're in isn't the only possible thing, for a lot of people that becomes a moment of hope and also a moment of clarity that the thing that makes me feel bad all the time isn't necessarily the standard or the normal relationship or the necessary relationship. And maybe it shouldn't actually be like this.
It's interesting to think about representation for me, and in this book, because I feel like there is a way that diversity is kind of built into the structure of this story, that because it centers around this group of 6 girls, and they have all different kinds of family situations. They are different, like 3 of them I think are white, and one is half Afghani, one is Filipina. But on top of that, not just racial diversity, but like just the fact that they all have different sort of magic specializations. That sort of diversity is really sort of built into the story, which I thought was really interesting from a representation standpoint. But one of the things that I kept kind of coming back to as I was reading it is, this might be a stupid question, but are you familiar with the show Schitt's Creek?
Oh, I am obsessed with the show Schitt's Creek, and I finished it, sobbed through the entire last episode, watched the documentary about it. I'm so into it. Yeah.
So there's this thing in Schitt's Creek where, and different people have sort of responded to this aspect of it in different ways, but where there's this very conscious absence of homophobia in the show, which Dan Levy has talked about. Like, he wanted to make a show where that just wasn't really a thing. For him, it was a way of showing, especially younger queer people, that, this is what the world could look like. Like, this is something maybe that we could aspire to, or at least that, like, here's a space where you don't have to worry about being traumatized in the watching of this in that way. I kept thinking about that aspect of Schitt's Creek as I was reading this book, because, for example, there's almost a total lack of racism in this book, or homophobia in this book. There are a couple points early in the book where one of the characters, runs throughout, where the character of Miriam, because she's Muslim, doesn't want to be involved in this. Not caper exactly. I don't know what the right word is, but she's worried about the consequences because of that aspect of her identity. But really, other than that, there just isn't there just isn't that, right? Like there really isn't all of those awfulnesses that we have to deal with so often in real life. To me, that felt really, I don't know, it just sort of went along with that whole feeling throughout the book of so many different ways of people being supportive of each other. And so like, that's another thing too, where I kind of wonder, like, if everybody who reads this would notice even that there just isn't very much in the way of racism or homophobia, but the absence of those things felt very palpable to me. And I wanted to sort of talk to you about that.
Thank you. Thank you for noticing that. It was very intentional. This is something that I've been trying to incorporate into all of my writing since my first book, River of Teeth. The first version of that manuscript was full of all the, racism and homophobia and fatphobia and misogyny that I understood to be necessary in storytelling. Again, because these were the stories I'd consumed my whole life, right? Every story I'd consumed about queer people had homophobia in it. Every story I'd consumed about a fat person had fatphobia in it. And so I was just like, oh, that's just how you do it. And then I got back this sensitivity read of that first draft that completely kicked my ass. I mean, this person correctly tore me a new one. And I didn't react very well at first until a friend pulled me aside and said, you're doing this wrong. Like, you need to see how the impact of this thing that you wrote hurt this person who read it. And also, why do you need that stuff? It's boring. And that completely knocked me on my ass. And it's a perspective that I have clung to in everything I've written since then, is that I find homophobia really boring. Like, narratives about queer people and especially queer teens facing and surviving homophobia are very important because that exists in the world, and it's important to know that you can survive that and still be the person who you are. But when I'm writing, it just bores me. I find it dull. I find writing a racist villain very dull. I'm like, okay, yeah, this is a bad guy because he's racist, but like, what if we didn't have that as the reason for someone to be bad? And instead, they're bad because of some deeper thing, or the interaction between people is bad because of something deeper and more interesting and more nuanced and like more flavorful than that. And I don't mean any of this at all to imply that people shouldn't write about racism and homophobia and misogyny. There's a lot of powerful work to be done there, especially by people who are in the communities that are hurt by the impact of that kind of language, behavior, and perspective. I don't know. I don't want to call racism a perspective. I don't know what to call it. Foolishness. I don't mean any of this to say that people shouldn't write those things. But in the stories that I write, I'm just not interested in it. I'm not interested in exploring what it's like to be a queer teenager who's getting called slurs, when instead I could be exploring what it's like to be a queer teenager who thinks that all your friends hate you for no reason because your brain is shaped in that way. I just like it more. I also really love giving my readers a home in my books, a book that a reader can kind of climb into and say, okay, I'm safe in this story, even if bad things are going to happen and it's going to get scary and it's going to get tense and it's going to get fraught. It's a place where I want my readers to be able to go without feeling afraid that I'm going to reach up out of the page and slap them for being who they are. It's interesting that you bring up the character of Miriam. She was one of my most heavily edited characters, and one of the characters that I thought about hardest in the writing. I grew up in a community with a very large Muslim population, a very large Middle Eastern population, a very large Southeast Asian population. So I grew up and had lots of Muslim friends, and, friends who practiced modesty by various degrees of head covering, friends who had food restrictions, friends who, had fasting days. Like, I was friends with these people. And so when I was writing this book, I was like, well, I'm going to write about my friends when I was a teenager. I'm going to write the diversity that was around me. Most of my friends did not look like me, and I wanted to write about that and how nurturing and how just good that was in my teenage life. And when I was writing Miriam, I was like, well, of course I'm going to include a Muslim character. Also, the YA I was reading at the time, I didn't see a lot of Muslim characters, and I was like, oh, I think that I would like to write a Muslim character into this book. And I wrote her in there, and I paid a Muslim friend of mine to give me a sensitivity consult before I started writing, so that I could say, what should I be watching out for? Like, this narrative involves magic. I don't know what the not just the like written down rules, but the traditions are in Islam around magic. Like, can we talk about that? Can we talk about how this should go? And she was very generous with her time, gave me a lot of information. I wrote the book. Then when we were getting ready to do kind of the second round of editing with the publisher, I said, I really want a sensitivity reader for Miriam. And the publisher was completely on board. I think we might have had that idea at the same time. And I went back to this friend and said, would you be willing to be paid by the publisher to do a full sensitivity read of the manuscript? And she came back and was like, hey, so this is great, except that you are pretty clearly a white person trying to write a Muslim character that won't make anyone upset. And she said this very kindly. She was very nice. It was very constructive. But the message was, you don't know what you're fucking talking about here. I had tried to really make Miriam one of the girls with regards to her approach to this whole thing. She, in the first draft, she didn't participate with the body, but she was really just like, no, this wouldn't be right for me to do because I'm devout and I don't want to participate in this. And the sensitivity reader was like, you are approaching this way too soft and naive. Like, she's got so much social pressure on her. Being a Muslim person in the same room as a dead body has a different impact than being a white person in the same room as a dead body. And if a cop walks into that room, you know what's going to happen, and it's not going to be good for you if you're the Muslim person. And so I ended up needing to bring more focus into the race dynamics in the friend group. And I still didn't want to make it a big focus because that's, A, I didn't really feel qualified to examine it closely, and B, there wasn't a lot of room in the narrative for that kind of tension. But bringing attention just in that first scene with the dead body to, hey, not everyone in this room is white. Not everyone is at the same level of risk. If you say, hey, let's call the police and like fess up, it's not going to go the same way for, Marcelina as it is for Iris, the Filipina character and a white character. And just bringing that awareness into the book was a huge shift for Miriam's character. Bringing the pressures that she faces as a young Muslim woman was a big shift in her character and the dynamics of the friendship. And I think made it so much richer. This is one of the many reasons I always strongly, strongly advocate for sensitivity edits and expert consultation.
It's interesting, I think one of the things that this is really getting at here, sort of going back to this idea of, when we're writing a story that is, where we're sort of purposely excluding racism or homophobia from it. At the same time, what you're not doing with this story is erasing race or sexuality as an identity. And to me, that seems like a pretty important distinction, right? Like, because, when I was reading this story, none of the characters, their race and their other aspects of their identity, those things inform the character, but they're not driving the central conflict either. Like you were saying, it is really important to have stories about confronting bigotry and dealing with those forms of trauma and abuse. But we actually have a lot of those stories already. So it's not like, by writing a story that has a different focus, we're not depriving those stories of existing. But at the same time, we're also not whitewashing these things, right? We're not like saying, oh, we're all actually the same, which to me, I found like a really, I really liked that about the story. It felt genuine to me.
Thank you. I think that that's something that I have been rightfully criticized for in River of Teeth and Taste of Marrow. When I was writing those books, I definitely did end up taking an approach of like, okay, everyone is on equal footing, and didn't really examine like race and class and gender and sexuality dynamics very much. And, I think that I wrote a good book and I wrote a good adventure and I'm happy with the product. But if I was writing them again today, I think that I would want to do exactly what you're saying of maybe not bringing in the racism and the homophobia, but still acknowledging that people are different and the world treats us differently.
Yeah. So there was one more thing before we move on to the second segment. There was one more thing that I wanted to talk about, which for me personally was sort of the aspect that sort of hit home the most deeply for me, which really has to do with the main character of Alexis and how she ends up relating to kind of everybody else in her life. And to sort of bring this in, what this was reminding me of a lot was actually another piece that you wrote, an essay that you wrote. I think it was last year. It was called Imposter/Abuser. That essay is all about this gap between one's perception of oneself and other people's perceptions of you, and how when we refuse to admit that we have power or importance or influence, that we're actually capable of doing a lot of harm to the other people that are around us. The ending of it, I'm just going to read the last few sentences here. We have a responsibility to use our power wisely and kindly and thoughtfully. It doesn't matter if we think we deserve to have the power we're given. It matters what we do with it. I remember when I read that essay, it really, really resonated with me, because for me, I'm the kind of person who I just tend to assume that if I'm not directly in someone's line of sight, that they forget that I exist. Reading this essay about how even having this impulse towards a certain humility is in some ways like denying other people to find myself important. Like if I don't acknowledge that I'm important to the people who love me, then in some ways that's not honoring them, and it might actually be harming them, and it puts me in a position to be able to harm them more. This seems really central to the way that Alexis, a lot of her central conflict seems to have to do with this exact thing. And she even has conversations with several of her friends, and in particular with Miriam, about this very thing. And so it really, there's this thing where you read a book sometimes and you can simultaneously feel totally seen by it, but also a little bit called out by it. That's kind of the experience I was having with this book. So I was wondering if we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something that I've been thinking about so much over the last 3 years or so as my career has taken off. My position and the amount of power that people perceive me as having in the publishing world has changed drastically. And it happened super fast. It felt like overnight, and I did not adjust to it fast enough, I continued behaving as if I was someone who wasn't perceived as having very much power at all, any power at all. And in so doing, I hurt people. I know for sure that I hurt people, and I'm sure that there are people who I hurt who I'm unaware of having hurt, because I was walking around as if I was barefoot, but I was wearing big stompy boots. It's something that I try now to navigate every interaction as if I'm the one who holds all the institutional authority. Not because I think I can swing that power around and influence people, but because it reminds me that I need to make a lot of space for other people to feel safe saying no to me. And I think that that's something that there's no risk in really doing. I think that if we all did that to each other, the world would be a much better place. I think that there are some people who will take advantage of that, which is why acting as if you have all the power is helpful, because it's like, I'm going to give you space to say no to me, but I'm also going to remember that I'm in charge of myself and of my surroundings, and so I have agency here. Because, man, when I was starting out, right after River of Teeth was published, right around when we did our interview, I was still thinking of myself as someone who no one had ever heard of. No one was going to care about my opinions. No one was at any risk of thinking that I had influence over their career. And I found out how wrong I was in a series of really difficult conflicts where people who I thought of as peers and friends turned out to be thinking of me as someone who could help their career. And why wasn't I helping their career more? And, there was this big disconnect that led to me getting hurt and them getting hurt. And it was all the result of me not being aware of where I was standing in their field of view. Alexis, and I think a lot of teenagers, and I think a lot of people, has that going on in spades. She thinks that she is a minor character in other people's stories. She doesn't think of herself as important to people. She thinks of herself as fundamentally disposable, and that she has to earn the space she takes up and earn the attention of her friends, and that if she causes too much trouble, they're going to be like, ew, get that out of here. And I think so many of us feel that way. I still feel that way in a lot of my friendships, where I'm like, oh, I better be careful not to take up too much time and attention with, my feelings and needs. I better make sure that it's only about these other people's needs. And really, that does such a disservice to friendship. I've, in the last year or so, been really trying hard to learn how to take up space in my friendships, and how if I do take up that space and a friend does reject me for it, that doesn't mean I did anything wrong. That means that they don't want to be my friend. And that's okay. And that's something that Alexis really needs to learn. That's something that she learns, I think, over the course of this book, is that her friends, the people who are actually her friends who love her, want her to take up space. You know, if a friend of mine is hurting or scared and they don't tell me about it because they don't want to bother me, my heart breaks. Because I want to be there for them. I want to love them. I want to support them, even when times are hard. And that was the big message of this book. That was when Dawan asked me, what do you wish you could tell your younger self? That was it. Is that the people who tell you you're not allowed to take up space are not your friends. And the people who are your friends desperately want you to take up space. They want you to come to them when you're troubled. They want you to be yourself around them, even when that self is messy and scared and making mistakes. And that's not friendship ruining stuff. And again, if it is, that friendship wasn't in the shape you thought it was.
Yeah. It's something that's often very difficult for me as a, for a lot of reasons. Like it's sort of a Japanese thing. It's sort of like just the way my family is, and sort of just the way that I am. But like, there was the people in my family are very like hardworking, and like, you don't impose on other people kind of thing. And it was a very difficult thing for me to learn, and I'm still learning at 40, that, like if you insist on doing everything for yourself, that you are sort of depriving other people the opportunity to help you. And that actually getting to help other people is kind of a gift. That this is something like, for me, I actually really enjoy doing things for other people, and have for, kind of as long as I can remember. That like, I really like it, that feeling of like, oh, somebody's relying on me. Somebody is I'm helping this person. I'm doing a good thing. But like, if I don't ever actually ask or even allow other people to help me, then I'm never giving them the opportunity to be in that position. And that, learning that was really, it took me a really long time. And so seeing that embodied in this story it just hit me like a ton of bricks. So
it's such a beautiful thing to discover. And I'm speaking very strictly this entire conversation from a white American perspective. I know that my perspectives on like society are not universal, but I think that we have this, this very capitalist individualist culture that says you have to be able to exist all by yourself, or maybe you can rely on like things you pay for. So if I don't have the time and ability to keep my own house clean, I can pay someone else not enough money to do it for me, and that's okay. But if I say to one of my friends, hey, I'm really overwhelmed by how dirty my house is, will you come help me clean it? Then I'm admitting failure instead of asking for support. And I think that's really broken. I think that when we're hurting and when we have needs, the most beautiful thing we can do is ask each other for help and share that help as freely as we're able, while still taking good care of ourselves and respecting our own needs. And I think that, this is a thing that society teaches us. This is a thing that our parents teach us because they've been living in this culture. They know how to survive and thrive in it and how to be respected. And so that's what they teach us how to do is, don't ask for help. Don't show that you're hurting. That's not what this world wants from you. But I also think that we can change that, a little bit at a time, when we learn how beautiful it is to help each other and how beautiful it is to give your friends the gift of getting to help you.
Yeah. Well, why don't we take a quick little break and we'll come back and do the second segment.
Okay, perfect.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
I would like to talk about food, because it seems to be the only thing any of us are thinking and talking about at all. And because it's on my mind, kind of constantly lately, as it is, I think, with all of us.
Yeah. So where would you like to start off?
I mean, I'm so fascinated right now by how everyone I know, their relationship to food has changed drastically as a result of this pandemic. There's so much planning and thought and stress and hope and desperation being poured into what we eat. And I've just been really fascinated to see that. You know, everyone is trying new things. Everyone is making bread or scouring the back of their cupboards to see what they can make. People are sharing recipes at what, I don't have data to back this up. This is anecdotal, but it feels like an unprecedented rate. Every Slack team I'm in has got a channel dedicated to food that is constantly in conversation. Where before it would be, you know, maybe once every couple weeks, someone would be like, oh, I made this thing. And it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah. My wife and I, we were talking, I think, yesterday about this, that it had been 37 days since the last time any of us in our household ate anything that wasn't prepared here, which is certainly the longest we've gone in probably ever. And it's weird because I think at the beginning of this, we expected that, like, having to prepare all of these meals, and especially because we have 3 kids, having to prepare meals for 5 people 3 times a day, and, you know, having to do all of that planning and having to do all of the labor in preparing the food, and then, like, never buying food that we like, you know, just not even the labor saving of it, but just like, we have a lot of restaurants around here that we really like and that we haven't been to in a long time. Eating out with our kids has been, you know, historically been a big sort of activity of ours. And we thought that we would miss it a lot more than it turns out that we do. It's been really kind of a weird experience, like how it is different from what we thought the stresses of it were going to be, you know?
Yeah, I feel like the thing that I miss most is variety, because I'm the cook in my home for the most part. And so, you know, I've got my sort of range of flavors that I'm accustomed to engaging with, and that range is pretty wide. But, you know, like, I'm not going to be able to make something like the 3-cup chicken that I can get from the takeout place nearest my apartment, because I just don't have that. I don't have the ingredients they have. I don't have the instincts that they have there. I don't have the experience. I don't, you know, and I can't make anything that even scratches that itch. I will say that the thing that has surprised me most is the volume of dishes. I've got 3 people in my household. We're all adults, and we're all eating 3 meals a day at home now for the first time ever. All of us, all day. And it's just like, how do we go through that many dishes? We're constantly like, oh, I'm gonna have to hand wash a plate in order to eat. And I just don't understand. I don't understand that, and I don't understand how we keep having to eat. You know, it's like, wait a minute. I made dinner yesterday. What do you mean you want dinner again today?
It's been a real interesting, like, I hear you about the dishes thing. I do probably about 99.96% of the dishes in my household. And it is certainly more than it used to be. I think it's one of the things that's been really interesting is, like, being home, especially with my kids, is, we're sort of taking this as an opportunity to let them become more independent. Like, hey, you could go fill up your own water cup now, or you could, you know, oh, you know where the snacks are. You could get your own snack. So in some ways that reduces the amount of work just because we're not doing that part of it. But then again, for me, it increases the amount of work because they're not, like, terribly conservative about how many bowls they use, you know? So,
yeah.
But
I think it's definitely being kind of in a capsule with the people in our household. I definitely am noticing with me and with a lot of my friends, it's forcing us to re-examine a lot of our relationships and habits with each other, especially around food and eating. You know, my household has had to confront some, like, habits that were born out of expectations and were starting to develop into resentments. I know my sister's children are becoming more fully realized people within their household because there's just a need for that, and they're also becoming more independent, and we're all having to kind of let go of some of our control over each other. I mean, I think that food is one of the places where everyone in a household comes together, right? Like, everyone intersects in some way, especially when we're cooking, as you said, 3 meals a day, every day. People are having to engage with each other around mealtime in a way that I think is unfamiliar.
I find too, the thing that you were saying about variety, our diet, well, partially because of the fact that I have young children still. Young children, at least in America, are not well known for having broad palates, shall we say? So there is that to contend with, but this was something that I think for my wife and I, we would run up against when we were in the before times that, like we would just like, I don't really want to eat spaghetti once a week, every single week. But like, okay, this particular child will only like, that's the only thing that we can count on that they will definitely eat with no fighting.
Right.
I would have thought here again, like that lacking some kind of variety from being able to bring food in, that would be something that would really wear on me after a while. But it's also a thing where and I think this is true of my wife as well, that we've been feeling so much gratitude for just the fact that we're, able to afford to buy a full week's of groceries at a time, and we're able to enjoy each other's company right now, and that we're all still healthy. That I don't know, that really does seem to add a lot of seasoning, I suppose, to the food that we're eating. Yeah.
I mean, especially when the company that you're in is good company, I think right now that is such a gift. I love cooking, and I've been cooking for my household for the entire time we've been together, but I'm feeling so much immense gratitude for the way we structure our meal times and our interactions with each other during those times, because I love these people very much and I like them personally, but cooking for them every day would be a little difficult on the old psyche if they weren't the people who they are.
Right.
As it is, every dinner time, they say thank you and they acknowledge the thing that I've made and usually give me a compliment. I love compliments. They give them to me. And we treat, the things that we make for each other as a thing to be celebrated. I don't think everybody can do that. I don't think that every household, especially in this extraordinarily stressful time, can find that gratitude just for the things we do for each other and for each other's company.
Yeah. I don't know. It is something that is on my mind a lot, that, I just happen to be in a circumstance where I legitimately like all of the people that I am stuck with. So, and I'm mindful of the fact that is certainly not true for everyone. So, but I am finding that this is a time, as stressful and anxiety ridden as it is also a time that is, well, I guess the way that I put it a couple of times to certain friends was that if ever there were a time to be able to both, that complaining would be permissible, but also that it's important to count my blessings, that this is the time. And I'm finding that I am able to do both of those things pretty well.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I feel like for so many of us right now, we're sitting in a real state of duality where we're feeling terror and also gratitude. We're feeling stress and also boredom. I think that a lot of us are doing this really beautiful thing where we're finally figuring out how to make space for each other and take up space. A friend of mine recently said, like, I've reached the limit of being able to stay cool about this. We're all talking to each other and saying, man, I'm really scared and I'm going to be honest about that. And it's going to have to be okay. And a lot of the people who we say that to, in my social circles at least, are responding with, yeah, that's okay. You're right. Like, your feelings are acceptable to me. And I just think that's really beautiful. I think that there's a really beautiful thing happening in this time of crisis where people are finally learning how to show up for each other and be kind to each other.
Yeah. Just to bring this back to the book for a second, there's the line about it's okay to be upset at upsetting things. That certainly applies right now.
I think each of my books has like some devastating line from my therapist worked into the plot. And that one is the one in this book. So often, so many of us will sit in a terrible situation and say, I'm sorry for making such a big deal out of this. And it's like, no, there's some things that you should make a big deal out of. Like, I remember my father is fine now, but had a brain tumor several years ago. And when he told us about the brain tumor, the first thing he said was, Now, don't worry about this. Don't let this ruin your day. And I just remember sitting there like, no, I'm pretty sure this is the thing you're supposed to worry about. And I think right now we're finally in a moment where not everyone is exposed to the same level of risk. Not everyone has the same level of access to healthcare, but everyone is in the crisis. There's no way to airlift yourself out of this being a crisis moment. This is a shared community trauma. And so we're all having to acknowledge, like, oh yeah, none of us are necessarily okay right now. And that's appropriate and normal.
Yeah. Oh boy. Well, so there's one question that I like to end with, and that is, if there's a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I'm going to give two answers.
Sure.
Answer number one is that I finally watched the movie Birds of Prey recently, and it was such a gift. I watched it at the end of a day where kind of everything had gone wrong. And I started the day by waking up with a sore throat. So I, had like a huge anxiety spiral about like, oh no, have I got the virus? And then everything else that could go wrong kind of went wrong. And, one of my friends who I was worried about didn't text me back. And, I dropped something and broke it. And like the dog threw up. And it was just all the little things, nothing huge and bonkers. But I was really worn down. And I sat down to watch this movie. And it was fundamentally perfect in just about every way. It was visually beautiful. The fight scenes are perfectly choreographed and executed. The characters and their relationships are wonderful. The emotional beats are ideal. The villain is horrible in a way that I've been longing for a long time. I just can't recommend it enough. If you're looking for a pocket of joy and relief, that's a really good place to find it. Birds of Prey, The Fantabulous Emancipation of Harley Quinn, I think is the full title. Okay, so there's that answer, and then I'm also going to give a little bit more like a literary appropriate answer because I feel wrong not talking about books. I recently read The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea by Maggie Takuta Hall. It's a book that I think if that was still a category, it would probably land under new adult. It's a challenging book. It's a beautiful book. It's very dark. It's about the cost that violence exacts from us when we commit it. It's about love. It's about romance. It's about adventure. It's about pirates. It's about literal mermaids, and magic and the power of stories. And I can't possibly summarize it, but it was really beautiful, really compelling. I could not put it down. It was healing. The Mermaid, the Witch, and the Sea by Maggie Takuta Hall. It comes out on May 5th. From Candlewick Press. You can pre-order it anywhere books are sold. I highly recommend pre-ordering it from your local independent bookstore to help keep them going during a time when income is tricky for them. And if you can't do that, you can order it through indiebound.org, which supports independent bookstores in the US. It's a really lovely book. Content warnings for reflections on sexual violence and a lot of just violence. A lot of, it's a pirate book that is pretty unflinching. But if you can handle reading those things, I think I found this book so healing and beautiful.
Yeah, I am actually going to be talking to Maggie next week about this book. So I'm really looking forward to it. I loved it so much. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to do that. So yeah, I also wholeheartedly give this book my recommendation as well. So great. All right. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I had a really good time.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful, and we'll have to do it again before it's been somehow 3 years.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes to where you can purchase all three of Sarah's recent books, When We Were Magic, Upright Women Wanted, and Magic for Liars. You can use those links to purchase a copy or three for yourself, or even better, you can look up your local independent bookstore and order from them. And don't forget to check out Sarah's newsletter at sarahgailey.substack.com. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me. The music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you enjoyed today's conversation, I'd love it if you subscribed in whichever app you love best. I'd love it even more if you left a review on Podchaser. There's a handy link in the show notes where you can do that. And if you'd like to follow the show elsewhere, you can find all of our social media information, transcripts, email newsletter, and show notes at keepthechannelopen.com. If excellent and inclusive audio fiction is something that sounds good to you, you can check out my other show, Likewise Fiction, where I read outstanding short stories by authors including Amal El Mohtar, Celeste Ng, Chaya Bhuvaneshwar, Maggie Shipstead, Rachel Lyon, and more. You can find that wherever podcasts can be found or at likewisefiction.com. Keep the Channel Open will be back on May 20th with a conversation with writer Maggie Takuta Hall, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.